You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the news from around the world and the local area. And we bring you fascinating stories. We're very fortunate in this show to have world-class athletes, footballers, coaches, trainers, all walks of life related to sport and even outside sport. And today we have a very special guest, an area that really fascinates me. A lot of you, the listeners, are aware I worked in sport for a long time and still do now on a consultancy basis, and I've always been one to be open-minded to bring people in to help performance of my athletes or footballers or whatever really. And this will give you a really fascinating insight, and especially if you're a fan as well and you wonder what goes on in the lives of sports people and footballers in terms of training, what other training they do outside the training ground. It's going to be really, really fascinating today. With, one of the best in the business, what she does. A lot of people speak really, really highly of her, so we're very privileged to have her on the show today. And what she does yoga, mindfulness, but there's a lot more to her profession than just mindfulness and yoga, which are fantastic. I'm a big fan myself of yoga and mindfulness, but she also does dance school and theatre. No doubt she'll tell us a lot more about what she does professionally in due course. So Sheila McVitty, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Hi Jimmy, thanks for getting in touch. Great to chat to you.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I've heard a lot of good things about your work, and I've been a big advocate of yoga for many, many years in sport for a number of reasons, and no doubt you can explain the benefits of yoga a lot better than me, which we can touch on shortly. But from your own point of view, if you give us a bit of an insight in terms of yourself, obviously you're very talented, very creative, so you do theatre, dance school, and you also do and work with football teams delivering yoga and mindfulness. Give the listeners a bit of insight in terms of what you do, Sheila.
Okay, well, primarily my day job at the minute is going into football clubs across the northwest of England and delivering yoga sessions as part of their strength and conditioning. There's also, as you mentioned, a big mindfulness aspect to that. So sessions may involve 30 minutes yoga, so mobility, flexibility, strength, stability exercises, and then usually around about 10 minutes mindfulness. And it's interesting that is actually the part that the players really fully engage in, so they really enjoy the relaxation element and the mindful element of the practice, and that's what frequently they ask for. So I currently teach at Everton Football Club, at Salford City, and Manchester United women's team. So alongside that, I do run a dance school. That's in the evenings and on a Saturday. And that's my dance school that I took over about 6-7 years ago, and that's been a really good vehicle for me to introduce values that are important to me, values of respect, ambition and positivity. Alongside that, I'm very fascinated by the environment of a football club and the organisational behaviour within that. So that has really led me along the path of studying an MBA at Salford University for CEOs of a sports organisation. And I really believe it's the CEO who really sets the culture of an organisation and drives that forward. So that's it in a nutshell, Jimmy.
That's really fascinating. It's really fascinating stuff, and you obviously, do a lot of, you work in a broad range of areas. And how did you get into it in the beginning in terms of the mindfulness yoga, Sheila? Just for our listeners to sort of get an insight in terms of how you sort of got into it to begin with, the actual concept itself, not so much just the delivery, but the actual, how did you get into yoga and yourself?
For me personally, it was absolutely by accident. So I just went along to a yoga class with a friend, and my personality and my own experience of sport has been very working, team sport, very driven, very almost impatient. You want to get quick results, and you want to, I enjoy running. I've played netball, athletics, and so I was aware of sport and involved in sport, but in a very active sort of, how can I explain it? In a active aerobic way almost. So yoga was absolutely the opposite end of the spectrum. With yoga, as you know, Jimmy, you slow everything right down. So and really you're focusing on your breathing, you're focusing on small movements, you're really getting to know your body. So really it was almost the antithesis of anything I had experienced before, and that fascinated me in a way that, in how it made my body feel, and how it made me feel mindfully as well. So how it calmed and relaxed a very active brain.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is research out there to suggest that, yoga is really good for, well, not necessarily, when I say really good, there is research around yoga being useful for people who've got, trauma, for example. Obviously, someone who has trauma, each individual is treated differently, but there is research out there, and people can look it up and so on and so forth. But equally in saying that, even subclinical people who don't have trauma, just generally, like you said, calming things down, it can be useful. Now, one take I've got on yoga, I'm just curious to see what your perception is. Many years ago, I would advocate yoga when I was sort of consulting different clubs and individuals. This is going back a long time ago now, but yoga was like yourself. I kind of fell into it, Sheila. I fell into yoga because I was having a lot of back problems and spasms, and I was doing yoga to help me out, and it worked really well for me. And this is sort of a bit of a blast from the past. I mean, many years ago, I was doing some consultancy work, and the place I was working at the time, we would work with a lot of professional footballers, and the guy who ran the centre was working directly with some professional teams. Now, I sort of introduced yoga, but yoga back then, this is sort of going back in the late 90s, was a bit different to now. I always recommend yoga, Sheila, but one of the reservations I've got about recommending yoga, when I first started doing yoga, you'd go to the class and I'd wear whatever. Now, when I recommend some people to go to a class, they come back and they say that, I wouldn't necessarily say they felt intimidated, but things have changed. This is my perception. It's become a bit of a fashion statement as well, in terms of who's wearing what clothing. And do you find that some of the yoga classes, or is it just me maybe out of touch with reality these days, are more about who's got the latest range, and rather than...
Yes, I do agree, Jimmy, definitely, to a point. However, I would sort of I would always defend yoga, because I think that certainly the body that I trained with, Yoga Alliance Professionals UK, they keep the standard really high, and it's actually really difficult to qualify with them as a yoga teacher. It takes, a good 18 months, and it's very... detailed, and I went on to do further study with Sarah Ramsden at Sports Yoga, and Sarah taught at Manchester United and Manchester City for many years, and was quite prolific in raising the profile alongside Ryan Giggs, of raising the profile of yoga. So while yes, it definitely does depend on the teacher that you get, and I don't necessarily agree with all the commercialization of yoga. There is a really strong ethical mindset behind yoga, and that underpins yoga. So most yoga teachers are well trained in terms of trying to really get the best out of their students, and really trying to send the message across that it's more about the students than it is about them. I think a word of caution, if you ever go to a class and it's obvious that it's more about the teacher than it is about the students, as in any walk of life, there's but I would certainly defend yoga almost. I think there is, most yoga teachers that I have met have a very genuine will to provide a therapeutic value to the students that they're teaching.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I think that I'm a big advocate of yoga. I think it's fantastic, and I'm really pleased that you've mentioned that and the listeners can sort of hear that, because I think, at least in my opinion, some people may feel a bit intimidated. Now, it's not for me to say what people, obviously, branding is what it is, and so on and so forth, and each to their own in the way they run things. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I can see a little bit like the gym, for example, back in the day, where that could be a bit intimidating, where you'd go in there and people were lifting, heavy weights and so on and so forth, and, where do I fit in there? And I think sometimes, at least the feedback I've had of some people were like, they went into a class and, there were people doing all sorts of, different maneuvers, and I think you've made a great point there. And yoga for me is for everyone. Anyone can sort of do and work on their own level, and that's an important point to make, where you don't have to be doing headstands and standing on one arm and so on and so forth to get benefits.
Absolutely.
Just work.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and perhaps don't believe all the hype or everything you may see on Instagram or social media. And if you have a bad experience in one class, perhaps try another class or another few classes.
Definitely.
Because the long-term benefits definitely outweigh the any short-term distractions, or if you're put off in any way, it's worth persevering.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a great point, and I'm glad you made that point. And from the point of view that you work with, obviously, high-class athletes, footballers, they are training every day for the most part. And in terms of your work with footballers, how have they taken to yoga in general, just out of interest? The listeners will be wondering how. I mean, obviously, Ryan Giggs openly had mentioned he did yoga and was, from what I can see, a big fan of yoga. But your own experience on your own journey delivering yoga to footballers, what's the experience been like, Sheila?
Very good question, and it has been variable. However, I think once the players start to really feel the benefits themselves, so again, the players have had to persevere with it, which is again back to my original point, that it almost teaches you patience. You don't get very quick results, so it almost explores a different aspect of your training and of your personality. You have to slow down, and you have to you demonstrate a certain level of endurance, and really push through it and practice slowing down. So I would say, certainly when I took over at Salford, or when I started at Salford City, I started on the very first day they turned professional back in 2017, July 2017.
Yeah.
And it probably took about 6 weeks of just consistent, a consistent session once a week or twice a week, I think it was, to really get them to get their buy-in. But once they did, that was it. They were absolutely hooked, so they and they did feel the benefit from that. And certainly working at other clubs, it has definitely helped, having Ryan Giggs as such an advocate of yoga, and Gareth Barry, who was at Everton, obviously, and holds the record for playing the most number of Premier League games. He was a big advocate of yoga, so it certainly helps me and my cause when I can quote those two players and their longevity as footballers, and they were the correlation with yoga thereof.
Yeah, no, that's a really, you made a really great point. I think it's really important to have those reference points, especially for young players. When I say young players, I mean players of any age, but generally speaking, young players, they'll look up to senior players and see what they're doing. And it's really fascinating. And one way I've sort of quantified things in football when I've brought in new methods, Sheila, has been in the way of, for example, making it more personal to them. So, for example, many years ago when I sort of brought in ice baths to football club I was consulting, I had to get buy-in from the senior professionals, and one of the senior pros said to me, why on earth would I want to jump into an ice bath? And I brought in the science behind it, and obviously it's debatable, but the point, cutting a long story short, I brought in the science behind it, and the science sort of went over his head, and I said, well, you know what, it's going to give you a better chance of extending a contract for 3 or 4 years. And he said, how do you work that out? It's because look at the research suggests that it's useful for injury prevention. Obviously no one can guarantee injury prevention because there's many variables, but I put it in layman's terms, it's going to give you a better chance of getting an extension to your career, and that obviously means money. And the players are obviously concerned about, they do play for the fans for the most part in my experience, but equally like anyone else in the profession, it's important for them to do the best they can for themselves and their families. And do you find from that perspective, doing things like yoga, it's equally as good for your performance, but also that range of movement and being able to give yourself a chance for longevity? I mean, what's your take on some of the benefits of yoga for footballers, Sheila?
Well, certainly those points that you've mentioned. However, it's human nature, and I think human nature amongst athletes, and to look to their more immediate goals. It's just difficult. Human nature. It's difficult to really look at longer term goals. We live in a society that wants instant gratification, but the flip side of that is that yoga teaches you that you don't necessarily get everything quickly in life, so it almost sort of helps you practice that delayed gratification. So while some players definitely do appreciate that it will prolong their career, it's maybe harder to convince other players of that. The main benefit is that they do get to know their bodies better. So I would say, their physical body first and foremost. They really get to know it in a much more subtle way, just by really slowing things down and really feeling what's going on within their body and tuning into that. And then, as I mentioned before, the mindful aspect is really powerful for some players as well. So just, again, slowing down, focusing on their breathing. And I was interested in what you mentioned before about the trauma and how yoga can assist past traumas, basically, that we may be holding on to in a physical way in our body, or we may have a physical response to. And I'm reading a really good book at the moment that you've probably read, Jimmy, called The Body Keeps the Score.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bessel Van der Kolk, and Peter Levine, sorry, yeah. And just, just the again, like you say, the science behind it, and it is helpful that you can then speak to players because they're a very intelligent group of people, and you can explain things to them that they will completely understand. And they are also very used to hearing this scientific terminology, from sports scientists and the like as well. So the fact that it can slow your heart rate down, it can reduce cortisol levels, all of those factors. Players are very open to that scientific evidence. Yeah, now that's a great point you've made there, Sheila. I can relate to that because a few years ago, I won't mention any names for confidentiality, but one of the biggest clubs in the world, some of the sports scientists there had asked me about cortisol levels, and one of the issues they had, Sheila, was the players were running high cortisol levels after Champions League games because obviously, you're travelling and you're coming back and the heart obviously the demands of the game and the travelling, and that would affect them on games in the weekend. Cortisol levels, I'm sure you're well aware, and to make the listeners aware, aren't great in sustained high levels, the research around that. But equally, we sort of bounced a few ideas. They'd invited me down to bounce a few ideas, and I suggested mindfulness and hypnosis at that point, just to sort of reduce the brainwave activity, and it could assist in helping them to do that. But the point being, all you can do is put the ball in people's court, and like he says, I mean, just show them the research and translate it in layman's terms, in the sense that this is what it is, and you go from there. And that brings me to the question that, I mean, Salford from a football club point of view, is close to a lot of people's hearts in this area. We've got great sporting establishments. For me, I think that it's got great staff, in the sense that, or at least the staff that I know that work there, are great people. So I guess the question is how important do you think it is that management backs, or the club backs what you do as a professional going in? And people are probably listening wondering, well, why wouldn't they? Because I, in my experience, have gone into clubs and it's just been a question of going in for the sake of going in to tick a box. But some clubs are different. If it's sort of filtering from the top and they really, really want to see the change and the benefit. And how important do you think it is that it's one thing having sort of pointing people in direction of, say, Ryan Giggs or Barry and saying, look what they've done. But how important do you think it is that you've got strong management in a football club to say, this person's coming in here to do this, and to get that buy-in? Is that something that you think is really important, Sheila?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely crucially important, and I think people pick up very quickly if there isn't that buy-in from above, from coaches or managers, and there's a few points to note there. In my experience so far, it has, while occasionally I haven't been called in to teach yoga, or I may have, a manager may have a different view or different priorities. I've never ever taken that personally, because the environment is such a challenging environment in terms of time and priorities, and the schedule is so jam-packed that sometimes something has to go. So I have always, hand on heart, I've always had the impression that there's a lot of respect for yoga within the profession, and that has just been my experience, but it genuinely has. I can't hand on heart say that I've ever come across anybody that has been has shown me disrespect for my position as a yoga teacher. Again, the flip side of that is that yoga we could probably do with more scientific research around yoga and around what the actual scientific basis for it is. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there is some evidence that it will reduce anxiety, and there are some studies out there on lower back pain. But I think there is definitely an opportunity for more research around yoga that may perhaps even enhance the buy-in from say a sports scientist perspective. But certainly I have to say, Jimmy, I genuinely have found the environment a very respectful environment to be in, and a positive attitude towards yoga. If it has ever been sidelined, it's probably more down to the pressures on time more than anything else, and I respect that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a testimony as well to yourself, Sheila, too. I think certainly that's going to be a variable with your experience and the way you approach it. I think it's really important, and certainly, from the point of view, so I sometimes wear a different hat, and in the past I've gone in to deliver education with the apprentices, just to help out now and again at different clubs whenever they've sort of needed someone to do some supplier work, and it's arrived in the past. And I think sometimes for me, this is my opinion, some of the younger players didn't always embrace education. Now, I've been a lifelong learner, and I'm all about education, because I didn't get the best start from an educational point of view in life, but I would go on and carried on in universities to this point now. And I used to tell the players that the statistics are, guys, you make it as a professional player is very minimal. Education. You're going to need it one day, but they all sort of in their own mind for one day they'll be strutting around and some of the players now, because they keep in touch, it's like on social media, and they do appreciate the value and they do understand that I want the best for them to do that. Do you think that the players are aware that you want the best for them, Sheila? Is that an important variable? Because people sort of, football, you get found out, I think, if you're going in there for whatever reason, but I think that, you strike me as, you want the best for them. Do you think that's really important?
Absolutely, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, Jimmy. I think when you say you'll get found out, and I think you would get found out very, very quickly in that environment if you didn't really have the players' best interests at heart, and that is something that I'm very, very passionate about, and with my dance school as well. It's one of my values. Every decision I make is based on the well-being of the students that I teach, certainly within my dance school, and I would reflect that with the footballers as well. And I think once they, again, it's human nature to weigh people up, but I think once the players weigh that up and they see that, then you have buy-in from them. And while it may not all, certainly in some of the very young players, the academy players, for example, you can't expect them to have full emotional maturity and fully understand that they're being taught life skills. Me as a yoga teacher, I just sincerely hope that at some point in their life that they may reflect back on some of the things they've been taught, and it may at certain points in their life help them in the future, even if they're not fully appreciating it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
At this point.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I think the brain maturation and at a certain point in one's life, and it's not until, say, 23, 24, 25 even, that from a maturation point of view, the brain, but that's all the more for doing things like yoga and mindfulness. And because I think for me, especially, it's a big call for me in terms of like a 16 to 18 year old, the whole life ahead of them sort of hinges on a decision. There must be a lot of pressure. And I'm not sort of excusing their behaviour at times, or at least what I've experienced, but I do think for some of them, like all their hopes and dreams, Sheila, and aspirations are on a decision, and it can be pretty tough. And do you find that certainly the younger players are sort of the pressure in that sense sometimes affects the way they sort of play and affects the way they conduct themselves?
I think it's a very difficult and challenging period for those players, at 17, 18, who are pinning their hopes on a professional contract, and it's a lot of pressure on them, and they certainly feel that pressure, but they're almost, quite often they're family members, or it's an extended family situation as well. So all I would say is that I think the clubs that I've worked at, when I think of Bury, even in the horrendous events that went on through the summer, the support that those players got was phenomenal, and so many of them have gone on to bigger and better things even, so they've had, there's some of their scholars have signed for Spurs, Leicester, West Brom, so and I would echo that with the other clubs that I've worked at. So while there's a huge amount of pressure, there is support.
Absolutely.
Mechanisms there for them as well.
Yeah, no, and seeking that support. And I used to tell the players sometimes that even if, for example, you do a scholarship, I'm not advocating they do one, but the options are there to go out to the States and maybe get a full scholarship somewhere, or some sort of scholarship. Then you get the education as well as playing full time, and there's plenty of options out there if they sort of apply themselves and put their head down. But also you can come back in the game, and an example of people coming back in the game, and it rings a bell. Many years ago. This is going back to 97, 98. The keeper coach at South. I don't know if he's still, if Nash is still the keeper coach there, but anyway, Yeah, I mean, I was.
Salford.
I was helping out a guy called Dave Richardson, who was the fitness coach at Crystal Palace, and he was running a fitness centre there, and he had a stable of footballers and other athletes and other walks of life, not just football. And I was helping out at his centre, and I was also helping him out planning the sessions that he was doing at the club and individual players I took under my wing. And Nash was one of the players I sort of used to do some work with individually over at, if he's probably listening, remember Lifeline, Health and Fitness. And basically, if memory serves me correct, I think he got released and he went on to play, I think, non-league for Clitheroe, but then he came back to Palace. So it can happen. You can make your way back in the game if you keep believing and doing the right things. And one thing that sort of struck me is that he didn't have to sort of do the extra training he was doing with me, the strength training amongst other things, but he sort of took it upon himself to do so. Now, that sort of brings me to the point that how important do you think it is that you've got to think outside the box in terms of training and not just rely on what's going on in say, 10 o'clock till 12 o'clock or whatever during the day? Do you think it's important, Sheila, that players do, where they can, make the extra time and effort to do extra training? Or do you think that basically what they do is obviously the coaches know? And what's your take on extra training?
On extra, I think if they can do it, absolutely brilliant, amazing, and fair play to them. I actually think that for 16, 17, 18-year-old, are you talking about academy players or all players? Yeah,
it's a good point. I think probably a bit of both. I mean, academy. We start with academy players, and obviously burnout is risk of burnout. But yeah, I mean, let's explore both. Your thoughts on both.
Okay. But my view on academy players, I think I take my hat off to them that they're as motivated as they are at the age they are, because I remember myself it being a very difficult age. You're trying to find your identity and who you are. So I take my hat off to them for their discipline. And likewise, I think that the professionals as well, they genuinely are extremely professional, more professional than in other industries that I've worked in, for example. This is, again, my own personal experience. And the vast majority of them, they take it really seriously, and they'll go out and they will seek out other things that they can do to get those marginal gains, and and they make sacrifices as well. So again, my own personal experience has been a very positive one, and I'm forever sort of pulling people up and defending professional footballers when they do get negative publicity, because I think for the large part they're a genuinely professional bunch of people who are trying their best and deserve credit for that.
Yeah, and I think so too. I think the game's certainly come a long way as well, Sheila. I think that over the last 10-15 years it has come a long way in that respect. I mean, I think there was a period where certainly it was about, I'll do the training session and that's the end of that. Nutrition and all these sort of things, sports science and psychology, as variables, they weren't really as prolific as now. I think the influence, in my opinion, of foreign managers as well as big impact to the likes of Arsene Wenger coming over here and people like that, and we all learn off each other as well. That's the sort of important thing. But I certainly think it's come a long way, and I agree with your sentiments there. I think this day and age in professional football, they are amongst some of the best athletes in the world. They train hard, they really put the effort in, and things have changed a lot, certainly. One thing I'd like to sort of see what your perspective is in terms of one thing that's fascinated me is different levels of the game. Now, you've had the experience of working at different levels of the game. You've seen, the highest levels of the game. And what do you think is the difference in terms of players at the highest level, Sheila, and players that aren't at the highest level? What are some of the observations that you have made? Is it maybe a bit of luck? Is it maybe genetic? Is it a combination of all those things? What would you say would be the ingredients? Just something I've sort of been fascinated for many, many years and done heart rate monitor tests when two different teams have played together and passively observed mindset. What's your sort of take on that yourself?
Well, I may be sort of stepping out of my area of expertise there to me a little bit, but because from my experience, I would reiterate the level of professionalism has been fairly level across the different leagues that I've taught in, and that goes from sort of Premier League to what was League One, but so I can only then assume that it does come down to technical ability. So, because I would hate to kind of, and again, I'm just talking from my experience, and that when I walk into a Premier League club and you meet players and they shake your hand and they're, thank you, and they'll do the session and they'll behave as professionals and, thank you at the end of the session. It's exactly the same at a lower league club. They see themselves as professionals and they behave in that way, and they approach their training and they approach their set. So if I was to make an observation, and if I was to have been surprised, I probably was surprised at how equitable that was. It was the same across the board, so I can then only assume that it is technical ability, of which I have to admit it's definitely not my area of expertise. While I love a good football match, I will never comment on tactics or technical ability. It's fascinating observation. I mean, it's fascinating to sort of hear your take on it with your experience, and certainly technique does come into it for sure, and I think the thing is, I think one thing that's really important in terms of the listeners listening in, and Salford being a really in this area, certainly a lot of people got a lot of affection and for Salford and what they've achieved, and one thing's for sure is the likes of, say, Chris Casper, who was at United, and worked with Chris at Bury when he was the manager there, and a youth team at first team level, and his attention to detail is immense, and he's really professional and a great person. But equally, I can imagine the four guys, Ryan Giggs and Bart the Nevilles, and the influence they've had as well on the club too. And these guys are professional guys. Their attention to detail is, I mean, they're used to sort of being in environments to where it's marginal, incremental measures. And I do agree with your sentiment. Certainly, the game, it's filtered through, Sheila, right through to League One, to even non-league now. And I'm working with a non-league club at the moment as well, and the attention to detail, the likes of, say, Brent Peters at Bake Up in non-league puts, is immense. It really is, and this is still sort of filtering through, I think, all the way down, and that's for sure. And that's one thing's for sure. And I'm like yourself. I defend the players, and sometimes they don't always get the press. I mean, for me, one thing I want to do with this show is give a balanced, fair press. And I'm honest and open, like yourself, and where things need addressing. But for the most part, they do a lot of good stuff outside the game too, Sheila. They do, visit hospitals and charity, and there's a lot of work that doesn't get seen, I think, sometimes, publicised. It really be great to sort of, and like everyone, I mean, you made a great point before about being young. We've all been there, and can you imagine for a moment, let's say the 18, 19-year-old gets their first contract and they've made it, and they're going to make the occasional mistake. Really, I think that sometimes it's a big call for people to say, I know they have a duty as a role model. I'm not denying that. But equally in saying that, I've got two children, and for me, role models aren't just sports people. There's plenty of people out there to sort of like also look at from the portrayal of role models. And so this has gone off-piste a bit, and I sort of, not to be sort of contentious, but what's your thoughts on sort of, role models in the world today in terms of football? I know they have a sort of, obviously we all have a duty, not just footballers, we all have a duty to be the best we can be. But do you think that sort of, that additional pressure from what you can see sometimes affects the players, or do you think that they just take on this in their stride? Honestly, I think it probably does have a detrimental effect on players, because I think, they're human beings like the rest of us, and they will, they'll like to go out and have fun, a lot of them too, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And and often it's innocent fun, and they can come up for criticism, and there have been some well publicised recent examples of that. But again, I think it's just approaching that, and I think this is absolutely a society issue, and I would come at it from this angle as a yoga teacher and somebody who is tries to practice compassion and empathy, on a daily basis, and tries to teach very much from that perspective. So it really is, it's demonstrating compassion. So I think we have to be really careful with this role model.
Absolutely.
Title, I was at a conference last week, an excellent conference in the run by the Football Collective at Bramall Lane in Sheffield, and the issue of role models came up in the women's game, and female role models and female footballers being role models. And while I don't doubt for a second that they are, my role model and the person who got me interested or raised my interest in football initially was my dad. So as you mentioned, it doesn't always have to be footballers who are the role models. We can all role model, and with our families and in our own ways. So yes, I definitely think there's probably the expectation is too high for this level of perfection and this level of role modelling. I think we should probably come from a slightly more compassionate perspective and allow people the odd misdemeanor, because none of us are perfect.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And I think that for me, it is that sort of compassion, and there was I did a meditation one time, was a love and kindness meditation with a group of high profile athletes, and at first I was like, does it mean I've got to express that love and kindness to my fellow competitors? I said, well, it's not necessarily in the sense that you're not harbouring anything internally in your own mind. You just free yourself out to go and play. But that's a long story short. But I can see society. I can see how society sometimes looks at footballers, and they see that sort of overindulgence, in the sense that sort of, they sometimes see the pictures of the highest level footballers on sort of boats and yachts and living that sort of lifestyle. But I do stress to the listeners that, and whether you can sort of, what your take is, and most players don't have that. It's a very, very small percentage of players that live that lifestyle, and even the ones that do, they work very, very hard outside that. It might be a week or two holiday they have here or there, but beyond that, they've worked hard to get there, and it's really hard to stay there. But from the point of view, sometimes the outside looking in, I think sometimes there's a misconception, and that's not undermining people. They only know what they know of players from the affluence point of view. Most players, I would say, the higher percentage of players don't have the affluence. They might have a little bit more than the average wage, but like you mentioned, the disaster that happened at Bury and so on and so forth, and it's not easy in that respect. And in terms of being a player at the in the lower leagues, tier of football, it can be quite challenging, in the sense that obviously they've got families, and they might need to move to a different part of the country, and so on and so forth. But you mentioned you do mindfulness, and do you find that helps for players that having to move and adjust to different teams and that stuff, to sort of be in the moment? And obviously it's privileged to be a professional footballer, but equally in saying that the stress of, will I get another contract, will I have to move my family, will it be enough? And do you think mindfulness is quite useful for that?
Yes, I do. And certainly at the end of the season at Bury, when I was as Bury was sort of coming to the end of its journey, shall we say, during the summer, I was going in regularly, and I don't don't want to speak on behalf of the players, but certainly I did get an impression that the sessions were always well attended, and I hope that it was helping players at that stage just deal with a difficult period of their lives. And it's difficult. I don't want to speak on behalf of any individual players, but anecdotally, and certainly the feedback that I get is that yes, definitely the mindfulness and the relaxation and the just being allowed to just take 10-15 minutes just to completely switch off and be in the moment and be guided through that process. And I do, I encourage players to do it themselves, and encourage everybody. There's some good apps out there that you'll be aware of, Calm and Headspace, and sometimes they're very useful if you're really struggling just to sit and meditate or be mindful yourself. Then those apps are great for guided meditation, 5-10 minutes, even 2 minutes, just to really slow things down and breathe and be mindful and calm the stress levels down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing's for sure, from the outside looking in, it was exemplary, the performances that they put in under what one can only imagine was challenging circumstances, and certainly there's probably not a great deal of research around mindfulness. There is in sport, there is research now coming through, but mindfulness traditionally, pain relief begins, and then stress reduction and Siegel, and they developed it more around depression. But from the point of view subclinical, there's not a great deal. But equally in saying that, one thing's for sure, certainly the performances were fantastic considering all the things. And I say that because I've spoken to people in business about mindfulness, and it's like, well, sitting there is not going to pay my bills, but for me, it's about sort of raising that default mode network and realising that we're all, in one sense, the rug would get swept from under all of us, really. It doesn't matter who you are. Life's a fine line, and there's no real, there's no real security in that respect for anybody. But all we have is the moment, and that's sort of.
And I think it's really worth noting that even despite the pressure that the Bury footballers were under, they conducted themselves with such dignity and self-respect and strength. So they're, wherever they were getting that inner strength from, they really were, they conducted themselves in a very, very dignified way in what was a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's one of them everyone's got problems on some level, and some people, we look, perspective is a big thing, and we can look at one person's life and think, well, but equally it's what's on your list at that time. And for me, knowing roughly the sort of wages they're on at that level and the circumstances they're in terms of family and movement and all these things that go on in their own life, it mustn't have been easy to turn in those great performances to think, well, okay, where will I be? And it's not easy. Obviously, in life, we've all got bills to pay and so on and so forth, and it's not easy. But being able to sort of be in that moment is really important. But from a performance point of view, Sheila, is that one area that you sort of work with too, say mindfulness for performance, in terms of being in the moment as a player and sort of immersing yourself into the activity, almost being Zen-like? Is that one area you touch on, or is it more for well-being?
It is, although I don't directly relate it to football and to them, actually playing football. But it is an area that interests me greatly, and one of my favourite books is Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Fantastic. Yeah, it is. Fantastic book. Yeah.
Don't ask me to spell it, but, but it is a great book. So I'd like to think that just by, and again, some research backs this up, that you can actually make some changes in your brain chemistry by practicing mindfulness. So the more you practice, mindful meditation, the more you are capable of being in that peak flow state. So I do like to think that there is some crossover.
Absolutely.
That one area that I would love to see changing a bit within a football arena is there to be more, a bit more of a crossover between the psychology and the psychologist role and, say, the yoga and mindfulness teacher's role.
Great
because
point.
I think there are definitely synergies there, and
great point.
And I think it would, in terms of a way of feeding this practice to footballers, or teaching footballers these key life skills, but maybe not in a very obvious way, with
Yes, no, absolutely. That's a great point. And there are certainly correlations and parallels, the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and flow and mindfulness. I guess the difference being flow is you're in that activity and you're immersed in activity, and mindfulness just sort of got that cut-off point in respect to, but equally in saying that the mindfulness giving the brain, if we can put it that way, a rest from all things said and done, and sort of reducing that activity in the brain can go a long way towards subclinical anxiety. But I think you've made a great point there. For me, there's a fine line between performance and clinical, and I think for me, certainly I would always advise any players, if they've got a clinical issue, to see a clinical person in that respect. But that all goes down to defining roles, absolutely. And there's grey areas, I think. There's grey areas, Sheila, like what sort of and the only way, I always say, always best to err on the side of caution. And if a player is suffering from severe anxiety, or I'd always say, well, maybe you want to go see a GP or clinician and just sort of get that checked in case it might not be. But equally, there's many pathways to these sort of things, and it could be organic, could be thyroid, could be clinical issues. Who knows, really? But
absolutely, and I think that's part of the skill and of the professional, or the person supporting the players, is whoever that is to recognise that and signpost accordingly to the correct professional.
Absolutely.
And for the most part, that's exactly what I see happening. But it's possibly from my own professional development. I'd love to work a bit closer with a psychologist to enhance what I'm doing really with the players. So and from an up-to-date research point of view, what's out there, what is really helping
absolutely.
These players, how can we elevate it even further than where we are at the moment.
And I think certainly the game has come a long way, I think, in that respect, and certainly in my experience of speaking to different psychologists and psychiatrists, and they've sort of in their own mind now, I know in the past there may have been a bit of a stigma around the way certain people work, but I think these days there's an open-mindedness, and I think the things like mindfulness not necessarily open the doorway, but equally I find it quite ironic sometimes that when people talk of mindfulness, that secular mindfulness, that it's almost like, well, actually, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, the Eastern philosophy was doing some of this stuff already, type thing. And I think it's really important that we respect those traditions, be it in sort of mindfulness or anything like that, because obviously the work of Kabat-Zinn is phenomenal. I'm, a big admirer of his work, mindfulness-based stress reduction, but equally in saying that the Zen and the protocols, you can go back to Buddhism, Hinduism, and they were doing it back then. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind for professionals too. But it's really, really fascinating, and what you do. And can we just sort of mention, because I'm mindful of time now, you're very kind to join us and share your insights. And in terms of yourself, you got the dance school as well. Can we sort of briefly mention what you do, the dance school and the theatre as well?
Yeah, so just my dance school, we have almost 200 students from the age of 3 up to 18. Some go on to be professional dancers, and that has just been a really great opportunity for me to really sort of, explore what my values are and what I want the culture of that organisation to be. So, and that is very much, my values are respect, ambition and positivity, and I think, that has sort of led me down another path, in terms of looking at organisational psychology and organisational behaviour, and I'm currently doing an MBA at Salford University and hoping to study and research that in more depth and within a football club environment as well, because we are just in a very turbulent society at the moment. It's obvious when you turn on the news, and I think a statistic that really hit me in the summer time was we were just having a chat around the dinner table with my family on holiday, and we looked at or somebody asked how many people around the world are involved in football, and I can't actually remember the statistic off the top of my head, but it was over 50% of the world's population have some level of interest or involvement in football. And it just struck me what an amazing vehicle football could be to facilitate change, really. So, we're really, by being involved with football, we're really in a very privileged position to potentially influence opinion, so in a positive way. So, that area of study really interests me. So
absolutely. Absolutely, and it's such a fantastic area for sport and the community. One thing about this area, we're very, very fortunate to have some football clubs in the area, but also sporting establishments, a lot of great people doing a lot of great work too as well, and that's one thing for sure that brings this community together. Irrespective of who you support, at the end of the day, I think we can all sort of find that sort of common ground that we're all just trying to do the best we can. And you've got big clubs not too far away from here, the Manchester United, the Manchester Cities, but you've also got teams that are making their way through their leagues like Salford, which is amazing, and long may the success continue. It's been a great thing, but time's gone really quick. It's been fantastic for you to join us on the show, Sheila. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I'm sure the listeners have got a lot out of it. In terms of your own, from a professional point of view, have you got a website you want to share with our listeners, anything like that, or?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at SMCV Consulting. I think my username is, or on Instagram. I'm fond of Instagram as well, Sheila _McVitty. But yeah, other than that, hopefully you'll see me around at football matches across the Northwest. I am a fan as well.
Absolutely.
It's been great talking to you, Jimmy.
Absolutely. That's been fantastic speaking to you too, and it's been a really interesting insight, and know that our listeners have got a lot out of that in terms of getting an awareness of different professions that work in the game, and we sort of see the coaches and we see the managers, but equally we don't often see people who do a lot of great work, not just behind the scenes but from the backroom staff point of view as well. But it's been fantastic having you on board the show, Sheila. I wish you every success, and no doubt we'll bump into each other at some point. But thanks again for being on the show, the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio, with your host Jimmy Petruzzi, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM. Until next week, same time, same place, 94.4 FM. Have a fantastic weekend, and look forward to you listening to us again next week. Thanks again.